Hi, this is my review of the beta version of Polaris, the role-playing game, Core Rulebook 1. This is one of the two books that you will need to play the Polaris role-playing game. Core Rulebook 1 contains the core system, the character creation system, and the setting, while Core Rulebook 2 contains the technology, gear, creatures, and advanced rules. It's possible to play the Polaris role-playing game just using Book 1, but in my opinion it feels somewhat lukewarm without the creatures and technology, because that will surely add a lot to the flavor of the setting and the theme. Now let's talk about what Polaris is. Polaris is a science fiction role-playing game, but instead of focusing in outer space, it focuses on underwater adventures and intrigues. So, what makes Polaris unique, in my opinion, is that I haven't seen any other science fiction role-playing games that give such a strong representation of the underwater aspect of science fiction. Now, let's talk about the quality of the PDF. Keep in mind that this is the beta version, so many of the things that I found lacking will be implemented in the final version. I already contacted Black Book Editions, and that will be added. So I found, for example, there was no table of contents, no hyperlinks, and the illustrations were somewhat heavy and some of them of low resolution, but all of that will be addressed. I also found a couple of typos, and I will send them in case they haven't spotted them yet. And when it comes to the explanation of the rules and the presentation, it's quite impressive considering this is the beta version. I didn't find any like dead ends or ambiguous things. Everything is well explained. And the illustrations, I think that they successfully represent the flexibility of the theme, because being a game focusing on underwater adventures and such, you could have almost any type of adventure that you want. If you wanted like an action-packed campaign, it's possible to have that. If you want to give it a bit more of a horror feel, considering the hybrids and mutants and predators of the hidden depths of the ocean, it's quite you can basically have any type of campaign that you want. And another thing that adds a lot to the flavor of the setting of the theme is that all over throughout the PDF you have flavor text and some stories and background and quotes that give a very strong feel to the meta plot of the entire game. Now let's talk about the contents. The story, the setting of Polaris is quite deep, no pun intended, and quite complex. It's basically this, and this is a very short summary because the timeline is quite big. You're going to have a lot of campaign seats and adventure seats spread out through the entire timeline. In the far future, the planet's surface became quite hostile. Natural and unnatural disasters and predators made it simply impossible to live there anymore. So humanity decided to go underwater. However, because of the technological limitations, this seemed quite impossible, but then the empire of the geneticians appeared and provided the technology and this knowledge of a mysterious thing called the Polaris flux, which I will talk about in a bit. And humanity managed to prosper underwater, but the empire of the geneticians became quite evil. They would be later known as an empire of evil. They became sort of like a dictatorship, and all humanity had to create the Azure Alliance and confront them and eventually defeat them. However, after the battle, a lot of the technological knowledge was lost. Some things were preserved, such as the hyper alloys and fusion reactors, but humanity was a bit crippled on the technological aspect. And then something really bad happened. This mysterious virus attacked humanity, and they became infertile. It was quite difficult to have children, and they started to conduct genetics research so they could produce geniuses who could find a solution to this or a cure for this virus, but everything still seemed almost lost. But then the hegemony, who was before that known as Hatteras, found this deposit, this depot or cache of genetician technology, and they managed to somewhat save humanity. And then you have a lot of different events concerning of the different communities and nations and factions that appear throughout the story, and each one trying to get the upper hand over the others. They managed to reach a fragile alliance of sorts, but it feels a bit like a Cold War kind of thing. And then appeared the Cult of the Trident, who had a great mastery over the Polaris flux. And what is the Polaris flux? It's basically a dimension of psionic or psychic power. It's another world. You can actually explore it mentally or physically through different means. And there are even entities living in that dimension or plane. So it's kind of like the magic or the psionic system as well of the it combines magic and psionics, in my opinion, of the Polaris role-playing game. And you can make a lot of produce all sorts of wonderful and surprising and terrifying effects wielding this Polaris flux. I will cover that later on in the review. And the theme, as I was telling you, is quite detailed. You have many technical details of different nations. You have information on different personalities. You have all the information you need to run underwater adventures and to explore every aspect of the game. You can have a lot of different adventures and do many different things. So, for example, maybe your adventures could be centered around like an archaeological expedition, finding the hidden and once thought lost caches of genetician and Natural Alliance technology. But you could also have like an espionage campaign, or maybe your characters are sort of like mercenaries or salvagers. So there are a lot of ideas to have different adventures and do anything that you like in this setting. Now let's talk about character creation. Character creation is really cool. It definitely breaks the mold of the standard things that you can do in what would otherwise be a standard science fiction game, because here you can create humans, but you can create hybrids as well. Some of them are natural hybrids, that is, humans that adapted to the underwater environment and are able to breathe underwater and such. But other hybrids are somewhat artificial, some of them through genetic manipulation, and others through a lot of they kind of feel like cyborgs, adding a lot of metallic and circuit parts to their bodies, and they can manage to breathe underwater and resist the pressure and such, and they adapt better to the underwater environment in general. And you can have different professions and skills and mutations, and that's quite nice, and that's what I think adds a lot to the post-apocalypse theme of the game. And different mutations could be somewhat gross in some cases, but they could also be beneficial. So for example, you can have a mutation that kind of like telescopes bones out of your arm and use them like a weapon. But there are some other pretty gross mutations, like you can have parasites or really gross things growing in your body. But almost all of the mutations have a positive effect to them. It all depends on how you use them. And you have a lot of pre-generated characters, because character creation, even though it's complex, you have different methods to make it a bit faster. And you can also customize the character creation process so that your game feels a bit more gritty or more heroic or pulpy. It depends on the type of game that you want to play. And the illustrations for the pre-generated characters are quite good. In fact, I think they represent almost an excellent variety of characters and the types of roles that you can play out in this setting. All of the pre-gens have almost everything statted out for you. You have a good variety of hybrids, mutants. Some of them look quite disturbing, and therefore are probably going to be quite interesting to role play as them. So that's quite nice. And the skill system, I also like it a lot, because I like skills that have an impact on battle and combat, not just outside of combat and when interacting with the environment and NPCs. So many of these skills will actually specialize your character even more on different combat roles, using armor or melee weapons or ranged weapons. But you also have a good variety of skills to the point that it would be possible to play a combat light campaign focusing more on the intrigues and politics of Polaris. And it's, as I was telling you, a good variety. So you have like bureaucracy, you have artistic expression, and then you have the combat skills such as handguns, sharpshooting, throwing weapons, and such. So in that further on shows the flexibility of the system. Now, when it comes to the core rules, they seem complex at first, but are actually quite simple. In general, you're only going to use a 6-sided die, a 10-sided die, and a 20-sided die. And it's about rolling below a certain number. You roll your 20-sided die, and depending on the modifiers, based on the difficulty or the easy way in which you can carry out an action, this will be further modified positively or negatively. But of course, your skills and specialties will have a greater impact on this as well. So it's all about rolling below a certain number. And when it comes to combat, it's all about opposed checks. And combat in Polaris is quite gritty, even in playing as a sort of like a heroic campaign. It feels like you're going to lose a limb if you're not careful. This is not a game of where you can just run around acting foolishly. And because the combat in Polaris is quite abstract, the underwater aspect of combat works quite well. Because other games feel somewhat clunky or difficult to represent where each character is in relation to one another, but here everything works fine. And anything that you can think of when it comes to the tactics of combat you can carry out, like rapid fire and wielding two weapons and many other things. And the martial arts system is quite detailed, it's quite pleasing, and because of the armor and the advantages of mutations and hybrids, it's quite more viable compared to other science fiction role-playing games to create a character that is mostly focused on melee. Maybe you have a very strong plating to resist fire, power, and such. It's going to be quite easy for you to get close and personal with the enemy. Now, when it comes to the Polaris Flux, as I was telling you, this is kind of like the psionic and at the same time feels like the magic system of the game. And I think that it's quite appropriate because there are many mysteries in Polaris. Like the Polaris Flux itself is quite a mystery. So using any of the powers related to the Polaris Flux is quite risky. There could be some disasters and side effects that could result of a bad roll. And you have different ways in which you can use the Polaris effect to act upon other creatures or even summon creatures from the Polaris Flux. So you have things like Force Barrier, you can call a Flux Beast, as I was telling you. You have things such as Molecular Regeneration or Disruption and Healing. So your character will be able to be customized in any way that you want. Maybe you can use Polaris effects that have to do with general utility, but you could also focus on healing or just causing damage. Now, what do I think of Polaris, the role-playing game, Core Rulebook 1 beta version? I think this is a game with a lot of potential. As I was reading the fiction and the setting, I think that if handled properly, this could become quite big, and it's obviously that it's going to be well supported. I'm going to put a link to the Kickstarter page below so you can see all the things that are coming up. So I like it, and I think that if you are looking for a science fiction game a bit out of the ordinary, because this focuses more on underwater aspect of things, you definitely need to check this out when it comes out. I couldn't find anything that was negative, like, oh, I hate that part of the system, or I don't like that part of the setting. And the setting, again, I think one of the strongest part is that, in my opinion, it represents a sort of tribute to many things related to fiction and reality. So if you tend to identify with different concepts and organizations or feel hostile to different organizations, you're going to find them here in this setting. And because of the technical attention to detail. Everything feels quite real, quite hard sci-fi, even though some of the things are quite over the top. So I like it. The Polaris, sorry, Core Rulebook 1, definitely something to check out when it is officially released. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.